Temporal anchors are often used in writing when people are discussing events or processes in relationship to the broader work itself. However, these can be a little tricky, so let's define what temporal anchors are and establish how you can use them effectively in your writing. What is a temporal anchor? Temporal anchors are words that establish how time outside of a written work relates to the work itself. We often might use a temporal phrase like before this or after that to show how two elements within a sentence relate to each other. But the temporal anchor is referring to something that exists outside of the writing itself and how it relates in terms of time and sequence to the work. There are, broadly speaking, two kinds of anchors: dragging anchors and secure anchors. Let's take a look at each and see how you can use them effectively. Secure anchors, specifically, are temporal anchors that refer to specific dates and times. Example, late December 1963 was a very special time for me. We see here very specifically late December 1963. This is a date that exists outside of the work, but the reader is very clear as to exactly when it took place. When I was 21, comma, it was a very good year. Now again, we have a specific time frame, when I was 21. So the reader knows exactly the age that is being referred to within the text. These are secure anchors. This approach ensures that the reader knows the exact time frame being referred to. The dragging anchors are different. The temporal reference lacks specificity and is strictly tied to the text, not a firm time. Example, 7 years ago, our forefathers brought forth a new nation. In this context, the 7 years ago is always going to be 7 years ago, 87 years. So whether you read it at the time the Gettysburg Address was originally given, or whether you read it today, it'll still be 87 years before now. It was 20 years ago today that Sergeant Pepper taught the band to play. When we begin by saying 20 years ago today, if the reader were listening to this song in 1967, 20 years ago would have been 1947. If the reader is listening to this song in 2025, 20 years ago would be 2005. So we see the temporal anchor drags with the text because it's related to the text and doesn't specify a year. So what's the problem with this? The dragging answers are clear upon and at the time of publication. Over time, though, the anchor becomes vague and inaccurate. For example, in an academic context, you might write 5 years ago, there was no research on the topic, whichever topic it is that you are investigating. So when we have that 5 year span and the reader reads this article in the year of publication, 5 years ago means 2005. However, when they read that article in 2020, 5 years ago is 2015. And when they read it in 2025, 5 years ago is 2020. So the time is changing and will become inaccurate. Likewise, we might write profits have increased over the last 10 years. Within this context, we have a 10-year span. If the work were published in 2010, then this refers to the years between 2000 and 2010. However, if you read that same article in 2020, it's now between 2010 and 2020. And likewise, if you were to read it in 2030, it would be between 2020. The problem is that by the time you read this in the future, the company may not even exist, and this timeline for the profits then becomes inaccurate. Secure temporal anchors are the solution in this context. Instead of saying 5 years ago there was no research on the topic, say before 2020 there was no research on the topic. And now the reader will know that up until 2020 there was no research. If they read this article in publication in 2025 or 2030 or 2050, then they'll still be clear on exactly when the research began. Alternately, profits have increased over the last 10 years. This again is the dragging anchor. Instead, we can write profits increased between 2020 and 2030, and then the reader will be perfectly clear as to what time frame you're referring to when speaking about the increase in profits. Let us wrap up with a quick summary. There are two kinds of temporal anchors: secure anchors and dragging anchors. Secure anchors refer to specific times. Dragging anchors are linked to the text. A lack of specificity creates temporal ambiguity with respect to dragging anchors. Whenever a text is read, that time frame will be associated to the time of the reading and not the actual time being referred to. Therefore, it is typically best to use secure temporal anchors to ensure that your readers are always clear as to when the processes or events you're describing took place. Questions? Hopefully that was clear, but if you do have any questions about temporal anchors and how to use them effectively, leave them in the comments section below and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. And until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.